Tesla passed a couple of updates to both the app and the car, and I wanted to show you those because I think they're kind of cool. First off, let's take a look inside the car. They have this cool new feature where you can actually change the color of the car that appears inside, because typically the car will be the same color as the one you bought. But a lot of people decide that they're either going to put a wrap on their car or repaint it. So the cars aren't always the same stock colors that Tesla has. So what they've given you the opportunity to do is to actually change the color of the way it appears in the car, which is kind of neat actually. Now I've decided that I'm going to change my car to look very specifically like the car from Repo Man. If you've ever seen Repo Man, it's a great 1980s ridiculous movie. Stars Emilio Estevez, and it's a really kind of a campy film about some guys who repossess cars, and there's this one really hot car out there that they're trying to get their hands on because there's a big reward for it. Turns out the car is carrying some sort of, I don't know, nuclear device or something, and the car starts glowing green. And because I love that so much, I decided to make my car emulate that in some way. I just thought it was kind of funny. It's an homage to the film in a way. So I decided on that, and I'll leave it like that for a while just because I wanted to pay tribute to Repo Man. The second thing is that the app will actually show the same color that the car is, which is kind of neat. But more than that, it gives you some information about charging and charging history in a way it's never done before. This is actually pretty cool. This is the basic nature of what some of the third-party apps do and what I was trying to build at one point to understand what the actual nature of charging was, how much I was charging, how often I was charging, how much I was paying for charging. So they let you go through it in pretty significant detail to set up your charging amount, or you can use the default based on where you live, which is actually pretty close to what I pay. And go ahead and let it figure out how much charging you have. I think this is actually pretty neat. It's telling you how much charging you've done at home, what the cost is of charging over that period of time, and then also how much you've used superchargers or third-party chargers. So it'll know if you're putting power in and you're not at home, and will actually detect that and say, hey, you're not at home and you're putting energy in your car. This is actually pretty cool and does actually give you a sense of what the car is doing and how the car is performing in terms of the amount of electricity that it uses. Now, there's still some pieces that are missing from it, like what your kilowatt hour usage looks like, though you can interpret that based on what the display shows as kilowatt hours, and also using some of the other numbers that are shown here. You can do a little math and figure it out if you want to. If you want to make it easier, you still should use a third-party app, but this is actually pretty cool and a nice little addition that Tesla has put in here to make this even easier. And now that we've looked at that stuff, I wanted to talk for a couple of minutes about some other technologies and emerging things that are happening, some in the world of Tesla, some outside of the world of Tesla, that I think deserve a little bit of attention. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes just talking about more things that are happening. Every day we hear about something new in the electric community, and I think it's pretty cool, and it's worth spending a few minutes talking about. I'm going to start with a story about a guy who wrote a blog entry about his experience driving a Tesla Model 3, similar to mine, getting stuck in the snow in DC during that big storm back in January. And it's really interesting because he was fully charged when he left the office, and he put the car in low power mode, was able to charge his phone, watch TV, do whatever he wanted to do while he was sitting there, but still had 18% of the battery when he got to a charging station the next morning. It just goes to show you that electric vehicles can be efficient in those situations, and he didn't have to worry about stopping and starting the car as you would with an ICE engine because you have to worry about carbon monoxide. Turning to a little bit of negative news, Texas wants to implement a gas tax essentially for electric vehicles. Because people aren't buying gas at the pumps, they're losing revenue. So they want to charge electric vehicle owners for not buying gas, which seems absurd to me on the surface of it, but you have to realize that everybody is looking for that dollar, and if they're losing tax dollars on gas, they want to make it up somewhere. So stay tuned because I think you're going to see a lot more of this coming. And then you have a story out of Virginia about how the dealerships are dealing with the fact that Tesla doesn't have dealerships and doesn't require you to come in for service. Dealerships make most of their money on servicing vehicles. So because you don't have to bring your car in for service because you get an over-the-air update, you don't have to pay those service fees. Well, Virginia wants to reverse that and say, hey, you can't put over-the-air updates. You're going to have to go into the dealership, in quotes. Remember, Tesla doesn't have dealerships, to make this really interesting. So they're really trying to complicate matters to make it so that they can stand alone as dealerships. Oh, those dealerships and their want to keep a stranglehold on the community. But turning to more positive news, One of the biggest concerns I have about my car is the tires, because there is no spare tire. Interestingly, there's a couple of car companies, GM is one of them, that's out there and looking at how could we make airless tires. And so it's really interesting that they have this idea, so effectively you'd never have to worry about tires. The tires are the next evolutionary thing that's going to happen, I'm sure. So it's interesting to see that they're doing this and they're actually creating airless tires. Let's see what the price point comes down to when they actually get into the marketplace. I did say I had sort of a melange of information here, a lot of different news items that I'd seen, and here's one about the open source charging network that this company has in mind. If you go to different charging stations, Tesla aside, and probably some of the other ones as well when Ford gets running and so forth, you realize that there's no easy way to seamlessly charge, and they're all different, and the way they're set up is different, and even some of the adapters are different. So they're trying to figure out a way to make it seamless and make it easier for the consumer, and I find that really fascinating because it will evolve the whole charging methodology. If we come to a standardized thing, you pull into a gas station, you always know that it's easy to just put your card in, pay, and then pump, and you're on your way. Shouldn't charging be exactly the same way? Turning to the actual batteries themselves, there's a pivot point happening where the battery price is coming down. Remember that for the price of my car in the neighborhood of $35,000, more than $20,000 of it was the battery itself, probably closer to $25,000. When it gets to that economy of scale where the batteries are less expensive, you will have an easier time getting cars at a reasonable price. So you're seeing that battery prices are dropping like 89% over the course of a decade, a little over a decade. And the government is trying to proliferate the battery technology and help in some way to move us that direction, which is a very positive thing. So look forward to prices coming down at some point. I've talked before about hydrogen and how hydrogen really can't be the future of cars just because it's so difficult to deliver and distribute. And you need to have it in place in order to put in a car. However, hydrogen can be used for other things like, say, large-scale networks where you need to charge military equipment or you need to fuel buses or something like that. And in cars, what if you had a tank that was at the car station where you had an electric pump and you actually used the hydrogen to fuel that electricity? Now that might work. Batteries themselves are always complicated and they take a lot of natural resources in order to create. So here's a company that's thinking about underwater tanks that would essentially turn the idea on its head. And they would allow for the underwater tanks to provide electricity by the way the water flows through it. Now, will it work? I don't know, but theoretically, certainly it's possible that you could use these water flows to create pressure that would then create electricity. So the idea is intriguing. But possibly better than that is this idea to use sort of a natural waterfall idea to be able to pump hydro and use it in the same way that you create hydroelectric power. So the idea is basically to create this power, but then use it as a sort of a battery because of the way you recycle the water around. So it's kind of clever. You don't necessarily need the battery to hold on to it. You're basically pumping water back and forth to create a circular thing that creates electricity. The idea, again, clever. Probably could work in theory, would probably take some very efficient engines, but it might be worth trying. Next up, I wanted to think a little bit about the batteries themselves. The battery technology needs a little revolution in its own. And so there's this idea to use quantum batteries to actually change the way we think about battery and battery storage. Currently, we use a lot of nickel and we use a lot of lithium. But the next generation technology could use superabsorption to make this different. The process is to use the ability to absorb light, which causes less charging time, and they intertwine with each other, and it's kind of technical from there. But the idea is really clever. And then how about this? There's a Kentucky town that's taking an old coal mine and trying to reuse the mine itself to become a water battery that's essentially an energy storage method. So going along with all the other energy storage I talked about before, this would kind of go into that same concept where you'd have a means of storing the water, then you could recycle around just to create energy. And it's like, this is so clever and so smart, and it goes along with those other philosophies and those other techniques. And it's a way to reuse something that's not being used anymore, because certainly we don't need coal in the way we used to. BP also wants to get in on the game. You've heard about other companies that jump in here. BP thinks that fast charging stations will actually become as profitable as fuel pumps, or currently are actually. And they believe the rising demand will make it better. So they're going to continue to put charging stations at all of their gas stations. So that way there's a charging network that they've created that they could use essentially the BP app to come in and get fuel for your car, whether it's gas fuel or whether it's electric fuel. It's very clever, and I got to give them credit for thinking this through and how they could make money and be in more places. Now, I did mention that there's a lot of different elements inside of your car in your battery, and they're lithium and nickel and other things sometimes that are hard to mine. So it's important to keep in mind that there needs to be a way to recycle batteries. Now, it's expensive to recycle them and actually take them apart and take the commodities out. So several companies have come up with ideas for how to reuse them in different ways and different philosophies rather than just taking them apart. Why not use them for infrastructure? So here's an article in Wired magazine that I'll link below that I think is kind of interesting because it talks about that in some great detail, and you can read about some of the thoughts on how to reuse these batteries, which I think is really, really clever. Now, here's a video from a company that actually is doing this, so sort of the real-world example of what's in mind. You take the car batteries and you recycle them. So we move on to talk about the idea of forever batteries. And the forever battery is essentially a battery that we're using today, but the idea is it has the two-way charging. So you've seen the ads for this in the Ford F-150. Tesla is going to be offering something like that in future models, and there's a couple of other car companies that have talked about it as well. The idea is that they're bidirectional in charging, so you can charge them from a wall outlet, and then you can use them to charge up something else outside, say your house, or just an appliance or something if you want to. So these batteries become more and more commoditized in a way where you have more ability to use them in some ways. It's very cool when you think about it. And then there's the prospect of what else these electric vehicles can be used for. So certainly farm equipment is something that's really kind of intriguing. It's a growing market where you start to see people using these electric farm equipment type things, where you're going around and you have tractors and whatnot that go around and help you with your farming. Then there are buses, and they seem to be more ubiquitous these days. I've seen more electric buses on the road than I can count. And my school district has actually started buying electric school buses. And you think about the bus fleet and how the internal combustion engine is hard to maintain. This is a really important and big step, I think, in the evolution of it. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was this cool patent I saw. And this has to do with using a stick shift to be able to shift an electric vehicle. The electric vehicle has one motor and it goes at one speed, and you can push it harder and make it go faster, but it doesn't have the ability to shift. There's a new technology that will allow a motor to shift and actually get more power from it. Now, will it actually work the same way that a clutch used to? Of course not. The clutch was something where you had to disengage the engine and change the gearing ratio to make it have more efficiency, more torque, so you could go faster. But this won't do that, but it will simulate the feeling, and you will be able to shift it in some way to make it feel like it's actually shifting. So there you go. There's a couple of interesting articles about different things that are happening, technology that's evolving, and sort of the next steps in what's happening with all of our electric vehicles and the way we think about them. And I just wanted to share all of that with you.